Okay, so as I just mentioned, it's the third debate between our two prominent realists, actually. Yeah, I don't think I need to give a long introduction about their bibliographies. Everyone study international relations or this field should be very familiar with Professor John Mearsheimer and Professor Yan Xuetong's works. Professor John Mearsheimer is best known for his offensive realism, right? And also proposed moral realism, combined Asian Chinese thoughts and contemporary realist theory, right? So everyone familiar with their theories, actually. So as I mentioned, that's the third debate between our two prominent scholars. The first debate held in the year 2013. The theme was, can China rise peacefully, right? I think someone could still have a very fresh memory about that debate. And the second debate in the year 2019, the topic is managing Sino-US competition, strategic competition. So today, we'll have the third one. The topic is global order and China-US relations. So we are witnessing dramatic changes in contemporary world politics. Yeah, in particular, I think compared with 2019, a lot of change. So we are going to listen how our two prominent scholars analyze current international relations from their own perspective. So this dialogue or debate will be divided into three sections. In the first section, each scholar will present their ideas, arguments, around 20 minutes each. And then we have about 10 minutes exchange. Yeah, you can raise some critiques or comments about John. Yeah, you can raise some questions for Professor Yan, and also Professor Yan can raise some criticism and comments. And then the third section, the floor will be open for questions and answers. I don't want to waste too much time. We just want to listen how John and Professor Yan analyze global order and the Sino-US relations from their perspective. Please join me to give the very big applause. Okay. So, John, you first, please. Do you want to come here or? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you for all coming out to hear me and Professor Yan discuss the international situation today. It's a great honor to be up on the stage with my old friend, Professor Yan. As you've been told, this is the third time that we've engaged with each other to discuss our similar views and different views about how international politics works. What I'd like to do here is just lay out my basic theory of international politics, just tell you how I think the world works, and I'm sure that many of you know the essentials of my argument, and then talk some about international order. My basic view of international politics is that it's all about a competition for power. At its root, great powers care enormously about the balance of power. And the reason they care greatly about the balance of power is that it's the best way to survive in the international system. And you always want to keep in mind that survival has to be the principal goal of any state. Because if you don't survive, you can't pursue any other goals. This is one of the problems I have with international economics or economics in general. Economics pays no attention to survival. Economics is mainly concerned with prosperity. Prosperity is nice, but the fact is you can't become prosperous if you don't survive. and economists don't pay attention to survival. Now, why is survival such a tricky matter in international politics? It's very simple. It's because, number one, there's no higher authority in the international system. There's no night watchman. There's no ultimate arbiter. To put it in Hobbes's terminology, there's no Leviathan. And in the international system, where you have all these states, some of those states are really powerful. You all know about the United States, and of course China as well now. So you have powerful states, and you can never be certain of the intentions of those states. And the reason that you can't be certain of the intentions of those states are that intentions are something you can't see. Capabilities you can measure. During the Cold War, I was in the Air Force. I was in Air Force intelligence, and we used to look at the Soviet threat. We could always determine what Soviet capabilities looked like, but intentions were very hard to discern. You couldn't get inside and see what was happening inside the brain of Nikita Khrushchev or Brezhnev or whoever was running the Soviet Union. The intentions were just very hard to discern. Now, if you don't think that's true, and you think it is relatively easy to figure out a state's intentions now, my trump card is to say, you certainly cannot figure out future intentions. You cannot tell me what the intentions of the United States will be in 10 years, 15 years, or what the intentions of China will be in 10 years or 15 years. So uncertainty about the intentions of powerful states is something that's going to concern you greatly if you're a state in the system. And again, if you get into trouble, if a powerful state has malign or evil intentions towards you and comes after you, and you look to a higher authority to rescue you, there's nobody there. You're lost. It's why we say in the realist world of international politics that it is a self-help world. As my mother used to say when I was a little boy, God helps those who help themselves. This is very important to understand. How do you survive in an anarchic system, in a system where there's no higher authority? And the answer is very simple. You want to be very powerful. You want to maximize your power. You want to be, in my lexicon, a hegemon. Because that's the best way to survive. You don't necessarily want to be a hegemon because you have naturally aggressive tendencies. You want to be a hegemon because in an anarchic system, a system where there's no higher authority, where there are powerful states, and where you cannot be certain of the intentions of those other states, it pays to be really powerful. It pays to be a hegemon. Now, to be a bit more specific about this, my argument is that you can only be a regional hegemon. You want to be a regional hegemon, number one. And number two, you want to make sure that no other state is a regional hegemon. The ideal situation is to be the only regional hegemon in the international system. And the United States of America is the only regional hegemon in the system. And the United States, unsurprisingly, and this is exactly what my theory predicts, the United States does not tolerate peer regional hegemons. In the 20th century, there were 4 countries that attempted to establish regional hegemony: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. And the United States played a key role in preventing all 4 of those countries from achieving regional hegemony. Again, the United States does not tolerate regional hegemony. Moreover, you want to understand that the United States went to great lengths to establish regional hegemony. As I like to argue, the United States started out as 13 weak colonies strung out along the Atlantic Ocean. And over the course of the 19th century, we marched across North America and we created a really powerful state. And then we told the European great powers, this is the famous Monroe Doctrine, we told the European great powers, we're not powerful enough to throw you out of the hemisphere now, but we will eventually be powerful enough, and when we do reach that point, we're going to throw you out and you're not welcome back. Distant great powers are not allowed in the Western Hemisphere. That's verboten, as the Soviets found out during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So again, you see what the United States did. The United States worked hard from the beginning to establish regional hegemony, to make sure that it dominated the Western Hemisphere. That was in the 19th century. And then, as I told you, in the 20th century, we went to great lengths to make sure we did not have a peer regional hegemon. That's my basic theory. Now, how does this apply to the world today? Well, most of you were born in the unipolar moment. The unipolar moment basically ran from 1991 to 2017. And in the unipolar moment, this kind of logic didn't apply because there was only one great power on the planet. It was the United States. It was a regional hegemon. Some would argue it was a global hegemon, right? But it was incredibly powerful. China was weak during the unipolar moment, and there was no chance you were going to try to achieve regional hegemony. But what happened is China became economically powerful. China became an economic powerhouse. Good for China, not good for the United States. But China becomes an economic powerhouse, and it begins to translate that economic might into military might. And it begins to think about dominating Asia. And I want to make clear, if I were the national security advisor to Xi Jinping, I'd tell him, we want to dominate East Asia. We want to drive the Americans out beyond the first island chain. We want to drive the Americans out beyond the second island chain. And we want to make sure we dominate East Asia. We want to be the most powerful country in East Asia. We do not want to suffer another century of national humiliation. You all understand that this is what happens in international politics when you're weak. When you're weak, the more powerful great powers prey on you. Study NATO expansion if you have any doubt about that. Russia was weak in the 1990s, and it was weak in the first decade and a half of the 2000s. What did the United States do? We shoved NATO expansion down their throat in 1999. We shoved NATO expansion down their throat in 2004. And then after 2008, we tried to shove NATO expansion down their throat again regarding Ukraine and regarding Georgia. That's how the United States operates. It was powerful, Russia was weak. That's what happens when you're weak. And the Chinese surely understand that. So you want to be powerful. Again, you want to be a regional hegemon. And you can see China heading in that direction. Most Chinese will deny this, of course, which is the smart thing to do, but the Americans are very suspicious. So, what is happening here in the world today? I'd say basically two things are happening. Number one, China is on its way to developing enough economic and military capability to think seriously about dominating Asia. And it should want to dominate Asia. It should want to imitate the United States. And oh, by the way, the Chinese are also developing power projection capability. They're developing a blue water navy, just like the United States. Do I blame the Chinese? Not one bit. But what do the Americans think about this? I told you, the Americans don't tolerate peer competitors. And you want to understand, this is basically a zero-sum game. The more powerful China gets, the weaker the United States gets. The more powerful the United States gets, the weaker China gets. So you're involved in this intense security competition. And as you all know, this security competition, underline that word security, is not simply a military competition, it's an economic competition as well. And that economic competition revolves around cutting-edge technologies. That's what explains what's going on in terms of U.S.-China economic relations. We, the United States, want to remain the #1 country in the world in terms of developing cutting-edge technologies. China, of course, wants to replace us. Again, I don't blame the Chinese one bit, but the Americans are going to go to great lengths to prevent that from happening. All of this is to say we are involved today in an intense security competition that shows no signs of going away. And if anything, will get worse with the passage of time. This is a tragic situation. It has nothing to do with Chinese culture or American culture. I know many people in China blame the United States for all this trouble, and many people in the United States blame China for all this trouble. That's not what's driving this train. You all remember that between 1991 and 2017, the Chinese and the Americans got along very well. And then something changed. What do you think changed? Was it ideology? Was it domestic politics? No, what changed was the balance of power. You became really powerful. And when a country becomes really powerful in the international system, you can rest assured that Uncle Sam is going to put its gun sights on that country. And that's exactly what's happening here. It's hardly surprising. So my argument is it's the system that has caused this intense security competition. And let's hope moving forward, when we have a crisis, and we will have crises, that we can avoid a shooting war. Let's hope that this one plays itself out similar to the Cold War, where although the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in an intense security competition, that security competition never turned into a hot war. Let's hope that's the case this time around. But it is going to be intense, is going to be dangerous. And I believe that the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union will define the 20th century. It will be the defining feature of the 21st century, not the 20th century, 21st century. Okay. Let me just say a few words about order, international order. And order for me is basically the bundle of institutions that dominate how states or dictate how states interact with each other. Institutions are basically rules, and an order is a group of institutions. During the Cold War, when I was young, there was an American-led Western order, and there was a Soviet-led communist order. And in that American-led Western order, what were the bundle of institutions? Well, it was the GATT at the time, which later became the WTO. GATT, IMF, World Bank, NATO, European Union. That was the Western order. Then, on the other side, the Soviets had their own order. Comintern, the Warsaw Pact, Comecon, so forth and so on. So there were these bundles of institutions that comprised these two, what I call bounded orders, not really an international order. And they were of enormous importance. Then what happens is the Cold War ends, the Soviet Union goes away, and its order goes away. And what the United States does, unsurprisingly, is take its order, take its institutions, and try to spread them all over the planet. And indeed, incorporate China into those institutions, into that order. And China actually goes along with it because it provides a way of helping China to grow economically at an incredibly fast pace. Think about the WTO. Coming into the WTO in 2001 was manna from heaven for the Chinese, right? You liked that order. But you know what happened? What happened is you became very powerful. And when you became very powerful, you meaning China, became very powerful, you wanted to upend the order. And it makes perfect sense. Orders are rules. Orders are institutions which are rules. Orders are rules. And the question is, who writes the rules? You know who wrote the rules in the existing international order that you were integrated into in the 90s and early 2000s? Uncle Sam wrote the rules. But when you became powerful, you wanted to write your own rules for your own institutions. AIIB, Belt and Road. I could go on and on. Chinese institutions will become part of a Chinese order, and there will be an American order, very similar to the Cold War. So the old international order that you were born into is either gone away, or going away. And what is happening now is a Chinese-led order is beginning to form, and a Western-led order is beginning to form. And these two orders will play a key role in the security competition between the United States and China, just as the existing orders, just as the existing bundle of institutions on each side played a key role in the waging of the security competition between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Just present your theory and how to apply your theory to analyze the current world politics. So I don't want to make some comment. We just move to Professor Yan's presentation. Please, Professor Yan.
Thank you, Professor Liu, for your introduction about this third debate. And actually, just now, I put on some notes about John's arguments. And first, I want to tell you the basic differences between me and John, although we are all belong to the same camp, realism. But even within the realism, and we have different views. And John heavily emphasized the balance of power, emphasized the importance of balance of power for maintaining the global order, the world order. But then I will emphasize the global leadership, how important and the leadership and for maintaining or maintaining world order or destroy the world order. And John heavily emphasized the needs or the interests of the survival of the great powers. And I certainly agree with that. That's a precondition for all the major powers. But then I will emphasize more on what? On the competition. And after your security was guaranteed, after your survival was guaranteed, you still compete for something else. For what? For leadership, for leading positions, right? Just like students, when you're guaranteed to attend the college, then you compete for what? Compete to go to the Tsinghua University, right? And so then I think there's two basic differences between me and John. And so my theory, moral realism, strongly emphasizes the role of the leadership. Actually, you find that today, if we apply the theory to today's reality, you find that everyone agree the current global order is already different from what we familiar 10 years ago, right? That order is labeled as a labor order. What means labor order? Labor order means globalization, right? The more international cooperation in all fields. And later on even had developed the global governance. But then it failed. The global governance can go nowhere. And globalization stopped. What replaced the globalization? It's a counter-globalization. So here we must understand why the globalization after the Cold War and was replaced by the current the trend of counter-globalization. My theory will say that because the counter-globalization and the counter-globalization because the leaders type has changed. After Cold War, you find most of the liberal leaders and hold power in many countries, especially in many major countries. But now you find the populist leaders and have become more prevailing. And certainly, most people often use Trump as a case to illustrate that. But actually, and many Trump leaders and today. And so during the during the Cold War, in that order, why the order was shaped in that way, like labor order, not only the norms, it's because the leading powers established labor norms. The leading powers prefer to obey these norms, behave themselves according to these norms. Today, they said, no, we don't like these norms. And the U.S. is a typical case, and the U.S. takes the leading role to what? To undermine the labor order, to take a leading role to violate the globalization. And they said, we don't like the globalization. The Biden administration clearly abandoned the use of the word globalization. They use internationalization for the globalization because now they organize the small clubs and the so-called small yard and the high fence. They organize the small clubs with the three countries work together. They say this is internationalization. It's not globalization. Globalization means that you're open to the rest of the world. So this kind of a policy actually accompanied with what? Accompanied with populism. Populism is gaining momentum. Nationalism is not a new ideology. Nationalism has been prevailing for several decades. All of us believe in nation states. I think John and me, we all believe in nation states. That's why John strongly argued that nationalism is very strong. That's true. But in this general concept of the nationalist or the school, the ideology of nationalism, there are at least two branch groups, populism and liberalism. Both populism and liberalism affiliate with nationalism. What happened? But these two guys fight against each other. Populism doesn't like the idea raised by the liberalism. They think, look at all these troubles, social problems, economic problems in the democracies, in Western countries, caused by what? By globalization. Globalization has already accelerated social polarization in Western countries. So most of the middle class and the poor people do not like the globalization. They developed the concept of anti-globalization. But the anti-globalization movement has started in very early period of a post-Cold War in 1990s. Then what? It went nowhere because they don't have the soft power, sovereignty. They cannot resist globalization. Who has the capability to twist the globalization to counter-globalization? Governments. These national governments, they have the power of sovereignty. They use the power, adopted a deglobalization policy to steer the globalization, a U-turn back to the counter-globalization. Like the typical case, like the concept, de-risking, decoupling, all of the economic security, all these concepts come derived from what? Idea of the populism. So now you see the populist leaders, they take advantage of the populism because that's shared by many poor people and middle class in their own country. They say, okay, that's not my fault, it's not my policy, and cause all the social and economic problems at home. It's because what? It's because of globalization. All of the domestic problems caused by foreign elements, foreign factors. It's not my fault. So how can we solve the problems? They say, okay, the best way to adopt economically, we adopt protectionism. Protectionism means that, okay, block our market, protect the market, and hide customers, and reduce economic interdependence with others. Politically, adopt the isolationist policy. So they said, if we stop the globalization, then what can we do? We can prevent the foreign influence on our domestic affairs. Then we are safe, we are pure. So we can identify ourselves as ourselves, And we don't like the foreigners, the immigrants' influence in the economy, in culture, in the politics. So that's their idea. That's why today we find the global order change. The new trend of global order is counter-globalization. Okay, then certainly today I think since the title is Global Order and the China-US relationship, we'll have to talk about how the relationship between China and the US impacts the current global order. My understanding, the China and the US relationship, and just like John argued, and it will be intensified in terms of conflicts. And you cannot expect it. China and the US suddenly find a way to settle down all the disputes, becomes partners. That's very, very, if it happened, it means our theories are wrong, right? And actually, why the China and the US conflicts will increase and to intensify is because now that we are in a bipolar configuration. The power structure is not multipolar. The current power structure is bipolar. And in the IR community, we all agree the situation after the World War I is multipolar. And during the World War II, it's bipolar. And after Cold War, it's unipolar. Why people agree on this? No one challenged these judgments. Because they have a common reference to judge the configuration. During the by what? By power, by capability, by ratio of the capability, not the absolute capability. After World War II, they judged the configuration by what? By naval power, roughly 3 to 2 to 1. UK, US, Japan, and France and Italy. And during World War II, then by what? Comprehensive national power. So the ratio between US and the Soviet Union is 3 to 2. After Cold War, no one's comprehensive capability accounts for about 1/3 of the United States. Japan's economy may be larger than 1/3 of the US, but if you take into consideration the comprehensive power, means including cultural and the military and the political influence, it's definitely less than 1/3. So what does it mean? There's a historical empirical experience tell us, and today we still have to understand what is international configuration is. It's not bipolar, it's not unipolar, it's not multipolar, it's not unipolar, it's bipolar. Because except China, no any other major powers have the capability or national power accounts for 1/3 of the United States. None of them, except China. I don't know how much exactly we can do the measurement, but at least China's capability is larger than 1/3 of the United States, possibly, I would say, 2/3 of the United States. That's why this bipolar system. Just because this bipolar configuration, and the US, no doubt, will regard China as main threat. It's not a threat to Americans' survival. No one can compose a real threat to the United States survival. But then they concern China as a systematic challenger to Americans' global dominance, the global hegemony. So in that way, and so from my understanding, now the competition between China and the US is not about survival, whether China and the US, who can survive. I can think this country will survive for the next 100 years. But the question is that, who will have more power to shape the global order? You see, after the Cold War, these United States advanced the idea for globalization, means economic marketization and the political democratization. They shape a labor order for what? they consider this liberal order is favorable to the United States. But now U.S. gave it up. They don't think the liberal order is in favor of the United States. For Trump, he said, hey, the globalization is in favor of China more than to the United States. But China said, wait a minute. This order is shaped by you. We want to continue. China strongly advanced the economic globalization, and China said, hey, we want to maintain the order. We don't want to change it. U.S. said, no. We want to establish a new order. China said, no. So then what China do? China said, okay, now we don't want you to change this order. We want to maintain it, but not exactly what it was before, but then we will modify this order. So China certainly wants to shape the new order. So now the problem between China and U.S., they heavily focus on how to shape the global order. According to whose plan? According to whose idea? According to whose agenda? And now, my understanding, why the U.S. is because John several times has suggested the U.S. government should united Russia and to compete with China, and then why the White House frequently rejected this idea. Not Biden administration. From Obama's period, many scholars suggest that U.S. should be nice to Russia, so don't push Russia into China's camp. Then why from Obama to Junior Bush and then to the Trump and then to Biden, none of them accept this suggestion? My understanding, because this is a bipolar system, bipolar configuration. During the bipolar configuration, they need support from whom? From its traditional allies, European states. They need European states to support America's containment policy against China. So at that time, they need Russia to play the role as a common threat to both Europeans and United States. This common threat can make U.S. easily to monopolize or win the support from the Europe. Otherwise, and the Europeans will say, hey, why I support you? If the Russian becomes the American's partner, and the Europeans say, hey, wait a minute, Russia is your partner, are you going to protect us? Certainly not. If Russia is your partner, are you going to stand at my side if I have conflicts, especially the survival conflicts with Russia, and are you going to protect me? They won't trust the United States. America need to convince the Europeans that, okay, your security, your survival relies on my protection. In what way? Make Russia as threatening as possible to these guys. Okay. So finally, let me wrap it up. And my understanding now, everyone, I think, John, you definitely will get the question. People will ask you about who will win the election in the next month. Here, I will give you my answer like that. No matter who wins the election, China-U.S. economic relationship will continue to deteriorate. The reason is that no matter Republicans or Democrats, xenophobia already dominated their mentality. They fear China to catch up, especially in fields of the economy. So for that case, no matter Republicans or the Democrats, anyone controls the White House, they will adopt protectionist policy against China. So that will be same. What the difference will be for the result of the election? That if Harris win the election, I think China and the U.S. will have more political conflicts than Trump win the election, because Harris is more reluctant than Trump to accept the fact China is going to catch up. And the U.S. no longer have that kind of a capability to dominate the world like in 1990s, Clinton's period. So Harris is more eager to maintain Americans' global hegemony, maintain Americans' dominance than Trump. Trump concerns more domestic interests rather than the international domination, but Harris will contain more international dominance than Trump. So in that way, I think if Harris win the election, and the China-US political conflict will also increase. Finally, I would say when we're talking about order, and actually, all the global order and already guaranteed by what? By nuclear deterrence between major powers. That means the nuclear facilities or nuclear weapons has already guaranteed, and neither the guys dare to go to the all-round war. So we're safe from the Third World War. But it doesn't mean that, and there's no military conflicts, military confrontation between major powers. These things may happen, but there won't be a war, especially in China and the US, and know that now this digital age. In digital age, and proxy war cannot help you become stronger. Proxy war cannot make you leading power in technology invention. So in my understanding, the competition between China and the US will heavily focus on what? On technology invention, rather than the competition between Soviet Union and the United States on the ideological expansion. This is the difference. So what does it mean? It means that it's less possible for China and the US fall into proxy war, like what happened between US and Russia now. You see, during the Cold War, you cannot imagine there's no proxy war between US and the Soviet Union for 15 years. But if you look at last 15 years since Obama adopted the pivot strategy and started the competition with China, there's no proxy war between China and the US. So this situation, from my understanding, will continue. I don't know how long, but seems to me 10 years is quite possible. So then what will happen? It doesn't mean that there's no proxy war between China and the US, then we are safe and there's less competition. No, the competition will intensify, but in different way. So the competition between China and the US will be different from that between the US and the Soviet Union. Finally, because the competition between China and the US, I think I agree with John, and will increase and brings about more conflicts. It will have an impact on the global order in return. Then what? It will strengthen the bipolar configuration, because this competition will impose more pressure on the third party to take sides between the two giants. And meanwhile, because the U.S. unilaterally distance economic and political relationship with China and reduce the economic cooperation, and then the globalization will become less possible, but the counter-globalization will become worse and worse. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Yan. Yeah, one word, two theories, actually. So which one do you like more? Which one do you think, which theory do you think more convincing? Yeah, it's really a hard choice, right? Yeah, so we can have some direct engagement and even fighting, right, between two realists, and then we can make this choice more easier, right? How about that? John, please. Yeah, raise some comments and criticism. Yeah.
What I'll do, if it's okay with you, I'll just raise one point, and Professor Yan can respond to me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So that we.
I
don't want to give another speech.
We can have several rounds. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to go back and forth. Let me say a few words about your views on leadership, and explain to you why I don't completely agree. And let me start by saying that for me, any theory is a simplification of reality. We live in an incredibly complicated world. And to make sense of that world, you have to come up with simple theories. And when you come up with simple theories, you end up leaving some factors on the cutting room floor. They're left out of your theory. And of course, sometimes those factors really matter a lot, and your theory is proved wrong. You all understand that no theory is right all the time. And that's because you leave some factors out, and sometimes those factors matter. Just to give you an example, I leave domestic politics out of my theory. As you all know, I wrote this famous book on the Israel lobby with Steve Wald. That book says domestic politics matter enormously when it comes to Israel, and that argument contradicts my theory. You understand? The book that I wrote with Steve Wald not only contradicts my theory, but it contradicts his realist theory as well. And that's because domestic politics mattered in that case, and domestic politics was left out of my theory. Now, I want to talk about leadership in that context. I leave leadership out of my theory. And I'm in effect saying, not that it's irrelevant. It's not irrelevant. It just doesn't matter very much. But for Professor Yan, leadership matters. I want to tell him my theory of leadership, and I'm going to put it in terms of my own theory, and ask him what he thinks about that, and ask him if I'm wrong, what is special about leadership that I don't understand, that he understands? Okay. My theory says leadership is very important. And leadership goes to the most powerful state in the system. Leadership is all about the balance of power. So, when Professor Yan says that states, once they establish their position in the balance of power, compete for leadership, I say to myself, no, states never are satisfied with their position in the balance of power. They always want more power. And what they're doing is competing for leadership. Remember what I said about the emerging international orders and the collapse of the order that existed during the unipolar moment. The United States led that international order that is now collapsing. It wrote the rules. As China grew more powerful, it wanted to write the rules or revise the rules. It wanted leadership in my story because its power had grown. So I would argue, and I'm very curious what you have to say about this, that leadership can easily be incorporated into my theory of competition for power. And I want you to explain why I'm wrong and what is special about leadership that I'm missing.
Professor Mearsheimer raised a very good question. What's the relationship between balance of power and leadership? And I think we have one thing in common, is that the balance of power is defined by leaders, by policy. In his book, he used the term decision makers. And it's not a state makes decisions. It's those people who hold the power of the state make decisions. So that's why we have to discuss about concern the role of the human being. Leaders are individuals, and they can be rational or irrational. State are just instruments. Instruments are not, you cannot say the instrument is irrational or rational. So here I will say why I'm concerned the leadership is plays a more role than balance of power, because that balance of power is really decided by the leadership. Like John said, I think we agree with that. No leader, major powers, satisfied with the existing power. They are hungry for more powers, endlessly, unlimitedly. So whenever they're talking about the balance of power, they say, hey, the balance of power, the current balance of power is not in favor of us. We have to shift the balance of power, make the more balancer toward us. no matter, even the United States becomes a unipolar leading power, they still concern the balance of power is not that favorable. They still want to have more power. So in that way, leadership decided what kind of a balance of power they can achieve. And they want to make the balance power and in favor of them rather than in favor of others. Second, and also because of the leadership and wants more power. And that depends on, that's very critical in my theory, is that how to achieve more powers. Different type of leaders and prefer different way to achieve more powers. Just like all of us are greedy for money, but then we adopt different approaches to making money. So the most easy way, what, is rob the bank. But most people say, okay, that's I do not prefer that way. That's really making rich faster, right? That other way. But I still prefer the other approaches. So leadership decides what kind of strategy to adopt for what? For achieving, for gaining more powers. That's why leadership is matters more than balance power. And also, I think the other thing is also very important. The leaders, because I just write a blurb for John's new book, How State Thinking, and the book has translated into Chinese version. I strongly recommend you to purchase a copy. I do advertisement for you, okay. So in this book, I think he realized that, and the policy is not made by state, by decision makers. And because it's made by decision makers, then what happened? Some decision makers are more rational than the others. So how can we cannot believe all of them are equally rational, never. And so here I will say, no matter, so then people may have different references for categorize the type of leadership, how to characterize leadership. But I will say, definitely the leaders are different from each other. Thank you.
I want to ask you a question on this. When you talk about leaders, it can have two different meanings. One is the state, two is the individual. States is what I'm talking about. In other words, China wants to be a leader. The United States wants to be a leader. There's a competition for leadership between states. That's different than a competition between individuals. And as you talk, it's not clear to me whether you're talking about states or individuals.
Well, actually, in my book, Essence of the Interstate Leadership, and I respond to these questions. People's concern that, hey, you have not clarified and the leadership at what level? Individual level, state level, or system level? Actually, my understanding, and if we're talking about the leadership of major powers, it connected all of the three levels. Because they are policymakers, they're definitely individuals at the individual level. And because they hold the power of the major power of the state, they're also at the second level, that means state level. Because they are major powers, certainly there are system level factor, right? And here, my understanding, and the leaders, the individuals are alive. That's what the target and worth our study. That's what we study. We try to understand why these guys make policy in that way. You rather try to understand why a state make policy. State never make policies. And so then you find that in the US, when Trump came to power, he adopted policies that were different from Obama. The US didn't change. The same institution, same state, same military capability, and same economic resources. All of the other factors, other variables are controlled. Never changed. But then as soon as you get a new leadership, they adopt opposite policies. That's why, from my understanding, the leadership really matters.
I want to ask another question. as you know, a theory is supposed to be simple. And when I listen to you talk about how leadership affects international politics, it doesn't sound like you have a simple theory. Can you tell me in brief words what your simple theory regarding leadership and the balance of power is?
Okay. But the simple description about my theory is that you have a moral leadership and you have a relatively stable global order. Otherwise, you have immoral leadership and then you have chaos.
So, Prof, do you have some, you can also raise some questions?
Okay.
on John's theory.
It's my turn to read question to John. Okay. The John, and just now I think most people read your book, and maybe not the very latest one, and they know your theory heavily focus on the system level. And I think both John and me, because we influenced by the Keynes walls, we think the international system do have impact on policy makings or have the major policy behaviors. But then my question is that, and in your new book, you're talking about the rationalities. And when you consider rationalities, and certainly it's not applied to the states, that rational state or irrational state, but the rational decision makers and the irrational decision makers. I want to raise a question to you. How can you think about a move from a system level analysis to individual or state analysis to the other levels?
Sebastian Rosado and I wrote this book on rationality in international politics. And basically what we were doing is writing a book about rationality, whether states are rational or not. It was not a defense of realism. It was not a realist tract. It was a book that simply tried to determine what does it mean to say a state is rational? Because you have to be able to define what rationality is to determine whether states are irrational or not. So that was the enterprise that we were engaged in. And as is evident in Professor Yan's comments, we were inside the black box. We were looking at actual decision making, okay? And as you know, my structural realist theory treats states as black boxes. It doesn't get inside the black box and look at how the decision is being made. But nevertheless, what we did is not inconsistent with structural theory. And what we find is that most of the time, states behave rationally. When you get inside the black box and you look at how the sausage is made, what you see is that states end up making decisions that are consistent with what you would expect from the black box, so to speak. And we also found that states sometimes, not a lot, but sometimes do not behave rationally. And those are cases that contradict realist logic. This is why I started off by saying to you, you want to understand that a theory is a simplification of reality. It leaves out certain factors, and sometimes those factors matter. And when those factors matter, your theory does not hold. Your theory does not describe the case. So all of the cases that Sebastian and I found when we got inside the black box and saw how decisions were made and saw that those decisions were not rational are cases that contradict basic rational logic, which is another way of saying that contradict realism. So that's what was going on there.
Well, following this question, actually, I want to read the book you wrote with Stephen Walt, and Stephen Walt is my Berkeley alumni, and you concern and White House policy towards Israel, and mainly influenced by the Israel's lobby in the Congress. Now the question is that currently both Republicans and Democrats and concern do not have a big difference in the policy towards supporting Israel's policy in Gaza. Actually, they kill a lot of civilians there. And Stephen Walt wrote an article, said that for realists, we suggest when there's a contradiction between the morality and the interests, you will give a priority to the interests. But the moralist, for realists, never suggest that you adopt a policy undermine both morality or the international image and national interests. Today, I think most people believe the White House adopted a very irrational policy in terms of national interests. But then that policy are agreed by the Trump and his people. So my question is very simple. Do you think their current policy is rational or irrational?
I think it's irrational, and I agree with everything you said. I think America's support of Israel in the Gaza genocide is strategically foolish in the extreme, and it is morally bankrupt. And it certainly contradicts basic realist logic when I make the argument that this is not in our strategic interest. There's just no question about that.
So the last question is about why state policymakers make irrational policy. For the leadership theory, for moral realism theory, we believe, and the policy decision makers make irrational policy is not because they have mental problems. It's because they care too much about their personal interests, and because they put their personal interests over national interests. So they adopt a policy, undermine their national interests, looks very irrational. So here I will ask you, because I think this is a really universal problem. People cannot understand why the American policymakers are so strongly and support the Israel's very unhuman behavior in the Gaza. And what's your understanding? What drives them to be so irrational?
Just talking about irrationality in general, there are a variety of factors that explain why states are sometimes irrational. In the case of U.S. policy towards Israel, it's largely a result of the Israel lobby, which is an incredibly powerful interest group in the United States, and basically forces any American president and Congress at this point to support Israel unconditionally. You all understand that the United States has a relationship with Israel that has no parallel in modern history. There's no parallel in modern history for the U.S.-Israeli relationship. We support Israel unconditionally. And this is when Israel does things that are not in the strategic interest of the United States. And the reason is very simple. Again, you have this domestic interest group, the Israel lobby, that is incredibly powerful. And if you have any doubts about it, you can read our book. There's a new book on the subject out by the Israeli scholar Ilan Pappé. And I know of at least one other case of somebody writing a new book that makes basically the argument that Steve and I made in our book in 2007. But there are other cases of irrationality. They're not due to domestic politics. They're due to the fact that sometimes policymakers have remarkably foolish ideas in their head about how the world works. And those foolish ideas get the policymakers into all sorts of problems. One of the cases that we look at in the book is Neville Chamberlain and the case of how to deal with Nazi Germany in the period between 1937 and 1939. And when you look at Chamberlain's thinking about how to deal with Nazi Germany, he just had what we call bad theories in his head about how to deal with the problem. It wasn't a domestic lobby or an interest group or domestic politics or him trying to benefit personally that caused him to behave in a non-rational way. And I could point to other examples as well of that sort. So there are a variety of factors that can cause a state to behave irrationally. But most of the time, the imperatives of the system, the structure, forces states to behave rationally. That's the basic argument that underpins realism. So my argument is that most of the time, but not all the time, my theory will be correct. But again, you want to remember, theories are simplifications of reality, and as such, they're not going to be right all the time.
Thank you. Thank you, John. 20 minutes dialogue between Professor Yan and Professor John Mearsheimer. So we have around 30 minutes left. So we just open for questions. So yeah, so many hands. As I mentioned, there are around more than 2,000 applicants to attend this event, but we can only accommodate around 400. So many, and be simplistic and just a few questions. How about that? Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you. That's extraordinary. My name is Vasilis Strigas, a visiting assistant professor at the Schwarzman College here in Tsinghua University. My question goes to John. You know, you always descend head on with the establishment, with the deep state, with the blob. And so, do you feel safe lately to be so, arguing so heavily against the establishment? Would you ever consider political asylum application in China? And more specifically, why do you think that the US has not been disciplined by the rise of China? So in the structural theory, the rise of China should have disciplined US overextension and entanglement in the Middle East and in Europe. So why hasn't this happened? Do you have any prediction about when is it going to happen?
So do you want answer directly, or we can collect a few questions?
I'll answer directly.
Okay.
I have challenged the establishment on many issues, for sure. But I don't have to think about political asylum at this point, and hopefully I won't, but one never knows, given how crazy domestic politics is in the United States these days. Second question, and the more substantive one, a very important one. My argument, as you know, is that the most serious threat the United States faces is the rise of China and the need to contain China. And at the same time, the United States is pinned down in a war in Ukraine, and it's pinned down in these conflicts in the Middle East. And this overextension, to use your rhetoric, works to the detriment of containing China. It's very important to understand that it's difficult for the United States to fully pivot to Asia and to deal with China, in large part because of this overextension, because we're pinned down in these two sets of wars. To take it a step further, if you're in a multipolar system, and I do believe we're in a multipolar system, although there's not much difference between the two of us on the distribution of power in the system, but if you live in a multipolar system and Russia is the third great power, if you're the United States of America, you want the Russians as your ally, not as China's ally. But as a result of our foolish policies in Ukraine, we have driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. This makes no sense at all. So you raised the question, why do we do this, and what's the prospect of putting an end to this? I'll say very quickly what I think the answers are, but I can't go into detail because of time. First of all, the reason that we're so deeply involved in the Middle East and we can't put an end to those conflicts, and they are not ending anytime soon, is because of the Israel lobby. There you go. We have a deep-seated interest in having stability in the Middle East so we can pivot. And we do not have stability, and this situation is getting worse by the day, as I don't have to tell you. And we can't do very much at all to influence Israel. Why is that? The lobby. With regard to Ukraine, we made the foolish decision in 2008, when Russia was very weak, to think that we could have another extension of NATO to include Ukraine. And we thought, as I said in my formal comments, we could shove NATO expansion down the Russians' throat. And we just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And it all blew up on February 24th, 2022, and we're now involved in this war. And it's hard to see how the war ends, and I would argue, I don't have the time to elaborate, that when that war ends, we are going to have poisonous relations for as far as the eye can see between the United States, the West, and Ukraine on one side, and Russia on the other side. We're going to be deeply involved in Europe for the foreseeable future, as well as the Middle East. And for the Chinese in the audience, all I would say is, this is good news for you, but it's bad news for the United States.
Okay, second one, about a lady here, yeah. Yeah.
And thank you so much for the wonderful debate. And I have a question for John. And I'm a PhD graduate from School of Social Science here. I did economic study. So I'm currently studying the energy section. So I have a very specific question for you. So like regarding the war in Russia, and do you think there's a likelihood that it's gonna resolve soon, say like next year? And if the war's gonna resolve, do you think, or if not, is there a possibility or likelihood for EU and Russia to establish a pre-war trading relation, in particular in the energy section? And what does this mean for the balance of power globally? And thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. I think that the Russians are going to win the war. And the reason is very simple. This is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, what really matters is the balance of artillery on one side and the balance of manpower on, well, the balance of artillery between the two sides and the balance of manpower between the two sides, because you have two armies that are standing toe-to-toe trying to bleed each other away. That's what a war of attrition is all about. And artillery is the main killer on the battlefield. The Ukrainians argue that over 80% of the casualties in the war are the result of artillery. In these kinds of wars, wars of attrition, it's infantrymen who do the dying and it's artillery that does the killing. Well, in terms of the balance of artillery, the Russians at different points have had either a 5-to-1 advantage, a 7-to-1 advantage, or a 10-to-1 advantage in artillery. When you have that kind of advantage and artillery is doing that much of the killing, you know who's in the driver's seat. Furthermore, when you look at the balance of forces on both sides, let's look at the balance of the populations on both sides. There are 5 times as many Russians as there are Ukrainians. Then to take it one step further, let's talk about air power. We talked about firepower on the ground, artillery. Let's talk about air power. In the early year of the war, the early months of the war, first year of the war, the Russians and the Ukrainians could not use air power to affect events on the battlefield. And the Russians couldn't do much because Ukraine had a lot of ground-based air defenses. Those ground-based air defenses have been largely eliminated, and the Russians are now free to roam around in the skies, point one. Point two is the Russians have thousands upon thousands of dumb bombs. Dumb bombs are bombs that have great difficulty hitting the target with precision. Well, the Russians figured out how to develop guidance kits that they can tack on, put on to these dumb bombs and turn them into smart bombs so that they are highly accurate. The Russians now have thousands upon thousands of smart bombs. They're free to roam around in the skies above the battlefield and do enormous damage to the Ukrainians on the ground. This is why now, today, the Ukrainians are on their back foot, right? And they're in terrible shape, and the Russians are winning in eastern Ukraine. The Russians are going to win the war. Now, to get to the heart of your question, the Russians are going to win an ugly victory. They're not going to conquer all of Ukraine. That is not in the cards. What they're going to do is conquer, I would say, between 20 and 40%. Hard to tell how much they'll grab. They'll take about 20 to 40% of eastern Ukraine, incorporate it into Russia. They've already annexed 4 oblasts plus Crimea. And they will also go to great lengths to make sure that Ukraine is a dysfunctional rump state, okay? But you're not going to get a peace agreement between the Russians on one side, the Ukrainians, and the West on the other side. No peace agreement. You're going to get a frozen conflict. It looks like the situation on the 38th parallel between North and South Korea. And this frozen conflict is going to take place in a poisonous environment where the Russians and the West and the Russians and the Ukrainians are doing everything to undermine each other's position. And to take it a step further, you have a number of flashpoints in that area that could turn that frozen conflict into a hot conflict. You have the Black Sea, you have Moldova, you have Belarus, you have Kaliningrad, you have the Baltic Sea, and now you have the Arctic. And conflict could break out in any one of those places. All of this is to say the present situation between Russia and the West and Ukraine and Russia is not likely to improve for a long, long time.
Okay, so, okay, the third one. Yeah, you, sir.
So hi, Professor Mearsheimer. I'm Yitong from the University of Chicago. The main difference between your view and Professor Yan is that China's behavior after becoming a regional hegemon, right? You argue that China, once it's free to roam, is going to behave similarly with the US, causing all the troubles in the Western Hemisphere. But Professor Yan believes if China follows a leadership-driven, a humane authority or Wangdao, the case will be different. And in the US case, being free to roam is heavily influenced by the foreign policy establishment or the blob. In the China case, would you think the result of being free to roam differs if the Chinese political system prevent the emergence of a foreign policy establishment?
Yeah, this is one of the points that Professor Yan raised that I wanted to engage him on. And so let me say a few words and then I can turn it over to him. If you remember, he said that China, a powerful China, would not threaten the survival of the United States. And his point was that it would limit America's influence around the world. And I agree with him that it would limit America's influence around the world. I have no disagreement there. But I do think that if China became a regional hegemon, it would become a threat to America's survival. That the United States would then view China as an existential threat. And it's because of what this gentleman described as the freedom to roam. And let me just say a word about this for those of you who haven't heard me articulate this argument. If you're a regional hegemon, that means you have no threats of any consequence in your own region. You are then free to roam all over the planet. Have you ever asked yourself, why is the United States roaming all over the place, interfering in the politics of every country on the planet? It's because it's free to roam. It has no threats in the Western Hemisphere, so it can deploy its military forces all over the planet. China can't do that. Russia can't do that. They're pinned down in their neighborhood. If China becomes a regional hegemon, by definition, it has no serious competitors, no threats of a security sort in East Asia, and it is free to roam. It is free to roam into the Western Hemisphere, the same way we are now free to roam into East Asia. All the Chinese in the audience understand that we, the Americans, are in your face. You understand that. We are in your face. We are right up against your border. We are running aircraft and naval ships up and down your coastline. We have ground forces in East Asia. You do not like this. Vladimir Putin did not want Ukraine to be in NATO. He viewed it as an existential threat. You don't want another great power right next door to you. Well, the United States does not want China to be so powerful that it's free to roam into the Western Hemisphere and maybe establish military bases in the Western Hemisphere the way we have established military bases in East Asia. You say this is impossible. You say that because you live in a world where China is not a regional hegemon. If China becomes a regional hegemon, it'll be a very different story. China, you know, is building a blue water navy. China is building power projection capability. China wants to roam all around the world. What is Belt and Road all about? What is this blue water navy all about? Now, I want to be clear. I do not blame the Chinese one bit, but you should understand that this scares the United States, the thought of China as a regional hegemon roaming into the Western Hemisphere. So that, I would say, is my argument to you on that very point.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, first, I think I agree with John on one point, is that for a rising power to be a global leadership, he really need to improve its relationship with its neighborhood. That's very important. That's why I frequently suggest that, and we should give the first priority to the relationship with our neighbors, rather than the countries beyond our neighborhood. But I don't think the regional hegemon is the first, is a precondition for becoming the global dominant power. For instance, and in the history we know, when the UK as the global dominant power, and UK is not a country welcomed by the European countries. And he has many rivalries on that continent. And he even fight with France over all of these the colonies. So my understanding today, actually, China, the competition between China and the US is not what territories you can occupy, who can occupy more territories, who can control more territories, like the 19th century or the 18th century. Now the key issue is that who can provide more advanced, sophisticated, but cheaper digital technology to the world. And so then if you can provide that kind of products and technology to the world, and then you will have more followers, because everyone's selfish for more economic benefit for their security. For their own national security, they need more cheaper and more sophisticated technologies. So in that way, come to the question about whether China will become the regional hegemon or not. I don't think China will become the regional hegemon because hegemon in Chinese is really a very negative term. It means you bully your neighbors, right? So actually in China, I think China should consider create or establish a friendship neighborhood and as the priority of its foreign policy.
Okay. May I ask a question here? Because as Professor Yan just mentioned, in Chinese, hegemon or hegemony has quite different understanding compared with in the Western context. But here, do you agree with John that China want to dominate this region, want to push U.S. out of this region?
Okay. Well, first, I think two questions. First is the definition about the hegemon. Actually, before Mengzi and the 300 BC, and hegemon, ba, in Chinese is not a negative term. It just refers to a kind of system of leadership. It had nothing to do with bad leadership or good leadership. But after Mengzi, when Mengzi said that the hegemon is bad, it looks good, but actually is bad in nature and is based on power to bullying others, and ba becomes a negative term in China. I know even in the Western society, in the ancient time, the hegemon is a neutral term, and maybe even positive, refer to a kind of a system of leadership. But gradually, this concept becomes a negative term. For instance, and after the Cold War, and American scholars use a benign hegemon. What do you mean benign hegemon? They know the hegemon is not good, but where a kind of hegemon is not that bad, so benign hegemon. Now recently, and even I think Harris used the term, and the U.S. will be now then, it's a hegemon, but it's a benign, something like that. So now from my understanding, hegemon is already become a negative term and universally. Second come the question, and whether China want to push U.S. out of this region. I don't think China want to put U.S. out of this region. China really want to put U.S. military capability and to further distance from China's border. And now the U.S. military presence is too close, and they patrol along the China's border. That's for Chinese feel, hey, you peer into my window every day. I cannot accept that. So China says, if you keep a comfortable distance, that's fine. So I think that's maybe that too much concern. China will push U.S. out of this region. No. And also China now still want U.S. invest as much as possible in China. And China do not want to resist America's economic influence in this region. Then to study at Tsinghua University, and China needs the Americans' capital and for this country's economic development. So I think it's a little bit simplified to pushing the U.S. out of this region.
John have two fingers, right? Yeah.
I would just say, I do believe that President Yan and almost all of the Chinese elites, despite what they say, are interested in making sure that China pushes the United States far away from East Asia. And number two, I believe they all want China to be, by far, the most powerful state in the region. They want it to dominate all its neighbors militarily. That doesn't mean they want to conquer them or coerce them to do X, Y, or Z. It just means that they want China to be very powerful. And again, they want the United States gone. I don't blame them one bit. But all I would say is that is completely consistent with my theory.
Okay, so we have around 10 minutes, so we can, how about, that one? Yeah, lady? Yeah.
Thank you for your real wonderful debate. And I'm now a student from majoring at international relations and foreign affairs. And when it comes to this topic, it's always essential to talk about Taiwan issue. So my question is for Professor Mearsheimer. And do you think the Taiwan issue is a core interest for the United States? And is the U.S. now taking dangerous risks with its approach to Taiwan? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think for the United States, maintaining Taiwan's de facto independence is imperative. And I think the United States is committed to defending Taiwan if it's attacked by China. President Biden has said on 4 separate occasions, according to my count, that the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan. And I believe the Japanese would as well, and I believe the Australians probably would. And that's in large part because the Americans believe and the Japanese believe that it is important from a strategic point of view not to let Taiwan fall into the hands of the Chinese. Now, your point is this is a dangerous situation, and one could say the United States is playing with fire here. And the reason is quite simple. China considers Taiwan to be sacred territory. It is profoundly committed to getting Taiwan back. And when the United States clearly stands in the way of that happening, there's no question that the United States and China are going to be at loggerheads and that this is a potentially dangerous situation. I think that is an accurate description of the situation. I think it's consistent with what you said. I don't see any way out of this problem. I think this problem is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. I think the good news is that it's hard to see how China can conquer Taiwan at some reasonable cost and expect that operation to succeed. The cost-benefit analysis argues in a quite strong way against China going to war over Taiwan. This is due in large part to the fact that to conquer Taiwan would involve a large-scale amphibious operation across the Taiwan Strait, and amphibious operations are among the most difficult military operations imaginable. And if you believe, as I do, and I believe the Chinese elites believe, that the Americans would be working with the Taiwanese and the Japanese and the Australians to prevent China from conquering Taiwan, it's hard to see the war breaking out over Taiwan anytime soon. I think the one exception or the one caveat to that argument that I just made is that if Taiwan were to declare its independence, in other words, de jure independence, I think that would go a long way towards provoking China to launch a war against Taiwan, even though the cost would be enormous and the likelihood of success would not be high. And that's because China considers de jure independence categorically unacceptable. Of course, the United States understands full well the danger associated with Taiwan declaring its independence, and therefore I believe, I certainly hope, that the United States will go to enormous lengths to prevent Taiwan from doing something so foolish. But I think your basic description of the dangers here is on the money.
Okay, because time is running out, we can just accommodate one question for international student. Yeah, for that, yeah, black, yeah, international student, yeah. Sorry, yeah, so many students want to exchange with our two professors. Okay, yeah, please, yeah.
Hello, thank you both for the wonderful debate. My name is Álvaro, I'm from Spain. I'm a graduate student here in international relations. You have both argued that there is such a thing as an emerging Chinese-led order, both regional and global, that challenges the USA's order. And my question is about the regions where China doesn't seem to want to establish its order in a similar way as the US. I'm thinking Europe, Middle East, and parts of Africa. And my question is, what types of regional orders should we expect to see in these places in political and security matters? And do you see like contested orders emerging with influence from both powers, or orders with unique regionalized characteristics? Thank you.
I think when you talk about China developing an order, what I call a bounded order, it will not be focused on a particular area of the world. It's a more general phenomenon, a more general set of institutions that can apply to different areas. Just take Belt and Road. Belt and Road involves Europe. Belt and Road involves Southwest Asia. Belt and Road involves Africa, and so forth and so on. So the order is not tailored to specific regions. And what's going on here is that the Chinese are going to develop, let me put it differently, the Chinese are in the process of developing an order. And remember what I said an order is. It's a set of institutions. It's things like Belt and Road, AIID, and so forth and so on. A set of institutions, right, that apply to all the areas of the world that you elaborated on. I think, however, China is going to have different goals in each of those three regions that you listed, Africa, the Middle East, or the Persian Gulf, and Europe. And I think in the case of the Persian Gulf, the Chinese are going to care greatly about that region for security purposes. It's because so much oil comes out of the Gulf and goes to China. I believe the Chinese are building power projection capability. They're building a blue water navy that's designed in good part to secure their lines of communication between the Gulf and East Asia, to allow China to project military power eventually into the Gulf. That's not the case in Africa. I do not think that the Chinese will be interested in projecting military power into Africa, at least for the foreseeable future. Their Chinese interests are largely, almost exclusively economic in nature. And I think the same thing is true with Europe. But I think the Gulf is different.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, first I make comments to the previous question about the Taiwan issue, whether Taiwan is a core interest of the United States. Obviously, the Taiwan is a core interest of China. It definitely is not a core interest of the United States. And Israel may be viewed by American politicians as a core interest of the United States. And about this order, my understanding that we must understand the international order in two aspects. First is order and the chaos. We have order or we don't have. So in that way, if we have a world war, that means that there's no order, only chaos. And without world war, then we can maintain order. So the global order has been maintained since the end of the World War II, but they are different in type. That means the norms and the normative order could be different types. Just now I'm talking about the Cold War order and the globalization order and the counter-globalization order. Now, how about China's policy toward the global the order? What kind of order China wants to shape? And from my understanding, China concern to prevent the war is the most important, because only we can prevent the war from occurring, and then we have order. Otherwise, there's no order. So that's why China strongly and persuaded Russia agree to not fight a nuclear war, and no nuclear war can be won. This is stated in the joint statement. And second, I think China's concern about the economic order different from what is a concern of the political order. Economically, China advocate economic globalization, or in some way we may use the term re-globalization. That means resume the international economic cooperation and the connection or the interdependence. But come to the political aspect, the policy is different. China advanced for political diversity instead of democratization. We all know that. And globalization after Cold War composed of two main parts, and economic marketization and the political democratization. And China currently strongly support the economic marketization. That means have a free global market economy. But in terms of the politics, and China do not agree with this global democratization. They concern that we should not use one reference or standard to judge every country's political system, or whether it's legitimate or not. So China advocated political diversity for the new global order.
Okay, thank you, Professor Yan and Professor John Mearsheimer. Because time is very limited, and there will be another event in this hall, so we can not collect more questions here. So we need to end this session, this very fantastic, excellent debate between two scholars exchange, and also for those questions raised by our faculties, colleagues, and students here. I'm teaching international relations theory for many years. It's a very strong impression for me that the progress of realist theory is not because inter-paradigm debate between liberalism and realism, or realism between constructivism. It's because intra-paradigm debate. Realists try to challenge realist scholars, actually. Yeah. Kenneth Waltz challenged Hans Morgenthau, established new realist theory, right? John Mearsheimer challenged, Kenneth Waltz, then established offensive realism. New classical realism challenged new realism, established, a foreign policy theory. And Professor Yan challenged other realist scholars, right? Bring leadership and authority into realist theory, establish moral realism. So we can say how realism evolved in the past century, actually. So I really learned a lot. Thank you. Please join me to give a very big applause to our two prominent scholars. And also thank you all for attending this event. We hope we will not wait another 5 years for our two prominent scholars. Next exchange or debate we can arrange, maybe we can arrange every 2 or every year, right? So we expect. Thank you. Anyone want to join us to have a group photo? Okay. Yeah, how about that? Yeah.